The Strange Survival of Liberal Britain, Politics and Power Before the First World War. The turbulent years of 1895 to 1914 changed Britain's political landscape forever. They saw a transition from aristocratic rule to mass politics and heralded a new agenda, which still dominates today. The issues of the period: economic modernisation, social welfare and equality, secondary and technical education, and a new role for Britain in the world were complex and difficult. It's the subject of a new book called The Strange Survival of Liberal Britain, and I'm joined by its author, Vernon Bogdanor. Good morning to you, Vernon.
Good morning.
Good to have you with us. We tend to think, misplaced perhaps, that the period just before the war, Edwardian era, sort of late Victorian, early Edwardian, it's all sort of dandies. It's a bit of it's a sort of stuffy period of history that gets shaken up by the events of 1914. Is that fair?
The picture you've just drawn is one that many people hold. It's true, but it's not right at all. And many people think it's an age of decadence. Indeed, one author, a British journalist called Simon Heffer, wrote a book called The Age of Decadence. But I've tried to show this isn't so. And we mustn't look at it through the prism of 1914, through the war, which, of course, was quite unexpected. No one thought it would happen at that time. It seemed an accident at the time. But if you look at that period, and you've summed it up very well, if I may say so, this was a formative period of British history when the foundations of modern Britain were laid. As you say, the democratic system, the welfare state, problems about economic decline, problems about Britain's role, Britain's relationship with Europe, dangers of foreign competition, and so on. All these problems are there. And of course, they're still there in some sense in Britain today.
Because the interesting thing about it is if you like, the first blush, or the impact of the Industrial Revolution, mass population move to the urban centres, improved communication, and although many people look back with those rose-tinted spectacles they are so fond of putting on at this period of time, even at the turn of the 20th century, the empire was beginning to creak of its size and because of social and economic issues.
Absolutely. This is quite right. The empire was a strain on Britain, and you had self-government already in places like Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and you had the problems in South Africa, which led to the Boer War. The empire involved a lot of money, and there were problems about how it could be held together, or indeed whether it could be held together. And those sort of debates, very fascinatingly, they're rather like the debates about Europe that we've had recently. Should we have a federal centralized empire or a much looser one, or would we perhaps be better without an empire at all? And it's the argument about whether Britain can only survive as part of a much larger unit, which was the basis, really, of our European orientation more recently.
And of course, we have huge new ways of thinking coming in. We talk about liberalism, but also we have Marx, we have Engels, we have communism, we have those ideas of the old ideas of staying in one's place and bowing kowtowing to one's I was going to say elders or even betters in the caste system, in the class system. Those were going out of the window as well, and blooming in arts and in literature and in mass communication.
Certainly, there were huge new developments in the arts, culture and literature, though I haven't written about those. And there was, as you say, a development of socialism. Not so much Marx and Engels, who really had very little influence in Britain, but the socialism of the Labour Party, which was something different. It developed, as I've tried to show in my book, out of the nonconformist culture of the liberals. It was a very moderate, religion-based socialism. Many of the early socialists were also strong Christians, and it was never the kind of dogmatic socialism or Marxism you often got on the continent. It was quite different from that.
Sort of very British, well, as it said, a very British socialism, but also, we talk about the liberals and their impact on British politics, and they tend, it's perhaps again because of the passage of time, we forget the importance that the Liberal Party had, and obviously the emergence of the Labour Party, and of course the emancipation of women.
Well, that's absolutely right. the Liberals were the majority party before the First World War, and I think they were on course to win the next general election if there hadn't been a war. Now, of course, after the war, Labour overtook the Liberals, but I don't think myself that would have happened without the war. Labour was very much parasitic upon the Liberals until 1914. There was an electoral pact between the two parties, and the Liberals could, if they'd wished, really have destroyed the Labour Party by competing with them. And then, of course, you mentioned the suffragettes, the emancipation of women. That's a very important issue of this period, that women were no longer accepting their role as chattels of men and demanding equal rights of citizenship. They didn't get it till after the war, and I think the war did make a great difference to their position when many more women joined the labour force. But you can see the seeds of it all before 1914.
So who were the, if you like, the movers and shakers then in this new sort of this new political landscape, or this ever-changing political landscape?
Well, the great heroes in my book are Lloyd George and, you may think remarkably, Winston Churchill. They were both founders of the welfare state. Now, we think of Churchill as a great war leader in the 1940s, and some may think of him as, well, a bit of a reactionary, but during the period before the First World War, he was remarkably forward-looking, and many of the things we now take for granted in Britain, like, for example, unemployment insurance, labour exchanges, and all the rest, these are due to Churchill, and his role has been a bit forgotten in that regard. He was a remarkable figure, and some of the things he hoped for and predicted really took a long time to come about. For example, he wanted the school leaving age raised to 17, which didn't happen for nearly 100 years after he wrote. He saw the need for public works during times of depression. He was a most remarkable man, and precisely because of his war leadership in very difficult circumstances in 1940, we tend to forget that aspect of his career.
Yeah, I mean, Churchill is a complex character. He seems to be hijacked by certain sections as this almost two-dimensional character, the war leader, but we have so many aspects of his time in South Africa. But then, of course, his controversial role with the Great Strike, during the Great Strike in the 20s, and his wilderness years in the 30s. So he is an interesting. But do you think he is, if you like, a cipher then for what Britain goes through in basically the first 50 years of the 20th century?
Yes, there's certainly something to that. I think his role in the general strike, though it's outside my period, has been misunderstood, because it's certainly true that he took a very combative role with the trade unions at the time of general strike in 1926. But he also, once the strike was over, was in the lead in trying to conciliate the miners whose problems had led to the general strike. And he didn't succeed in this conciliation, but he was not this purblind reactionary that many think. And one aspect of Churchill which people sometimes forget is how very well read he was. Although he didn't go to university, when he was in the army in India, sometimes there was nothing to do in the afternoons, in the hot afternoons. So he asked his mother to send him books to read. And he read, for example, the whole of Macaulay, the whole of Gibbon. He read a lot of philosophy, which turned him, I think, into an agnostic rather than a Christian. He was much better read than most British politicians, even though, perhaps because he didn't go to university. And he had this tremendous energy. By the time he got into Parliament in 1900, when he was 25, he'd already written 5 books. And in the next 6 years, he wrote a very scholarly 2-volume biography of his father, who'd been Chancellor of the Exchequer. And he was a very remarkable man who could have lived on his writing had he chosen to do so. The
other thing we have to bear in mind is it's the Edwardian period, and again, it seems to be almost looked over as that bit between the great Victorian reign and the horrors of the First World War. But people may think that it is just sort of a quaint period of history. But the Edwardians themselves regarded themselves as forward-thinking, progressive, futuristic. And again, one of the things that strikes it is rational. And if you look at the way that other events through Europe were becoming so radical, and the the political strife and the bloodletting in some cases. The Edwardian era seems to be a period of rational debate.
Absolutely right. If I may say so, you've understood my book much better than most of the reviewers. This is exactly what I say, that the success of Britain was due to the strength of parliamentary and rational debate, and it was, as you imply, a haven of liberal tolerance compared with the countries of the continent, and advancing along those lines. What it couldn't cope with was the aggression of Germany and Austria in 1914. This was not predicted. Britain wasn't prepared for it. We had hardly any army, and Lord Kitchener, who became Secretary of War, said we had a town clerk's army, and Bismarck had once said that if the British army landed in Hamburg, he'd get the police to arrest it because it was so small. And that was because we relied on the navy, and that we found wasn't enough. So this is one lesson, perhaps for today, that our defence was very weak in 1914, and again, it has to be said, in 1939. The liberal mind, if you like, couldn't comprehend some of the irrational things happening on the continent.
Indeed, but also weighed against that, you mentioned sort of the Kaiser, the Kaiser's army and the Austro-Hungarians, for example. But they go into 1914, and of the three great European royal families that go into the war, Russia, Germany, and the British, the only one standing at the end of it is the British, because we know what happens in 1917 in Russia, and the German situation is a throwback to, and there are warnings for the British there as well, or just perhaps there are lessons, because the British Empire and the British parliaments are, if you like, more advanced, more liberal, more mobile, while Germany, unfortunately, has put itself on this Kaiser as basically almost representative of God on earth. And only too late do they realize, and the generals realize, that what is going on with the Kaiser, and that's almost a chilling warning for what's going to happen 20 years later.
Yes, these empires suffered from military defeat, and the monarchy was destroyed because it was identified with military defeat. We, of course, were victorious, but perhaps equally important, we'd already developed into a constitutional monarchy, so that the king wasn't blamed for policies that people didn't like. They blamed the government and kept the king. The king was above it all. And it was said that Queen Victoria, who died in 1901, was the first constitutional monarch the world had ever known. Well, she was rather partisan, it has to be said, but her successors, Edward VII and George V, much less so. And by 1914, it was broadly established that the king was neutral between political parties, and that helped survival of the monarchy. And
that's always been key, and that brings us all the way through to the 21st century and the events of the past 5 years stroke decade. And this is perhaps one of the central points of your book, is the fact that it is, despite people wanting to reform or radicalize, or in some cases completely demolish it, the British parliamentary system is a system that, like it or loathe it, tends to work.
Yes, I think that's right. And we did see it last year in the replacement of Liz Truss by Rishi Sunak. We had a prime minister who wasn't suitable, and she was removed without fuss, without riots, speedily and efficiently. Now, it's not so easy to remove an American president who's a dud. You may argue President Trump's in that position. It's not easy to remove a French president who's no good. And it's not so easy to remove some of the coalitional leaders on the continent, because often the prime minister there is chosen through a coalition agreement, and you can't really untie it. The British Constitution did work last year. I'm in favour, let me say, of various changes to it, but it has to be said it worked very well in removing a prime minister who wasn't up to the job. And
also during this period, I talked about mass communication, perhaps mass awareness, because we have a political system and political leaders who actually care about the constituents or care about the people who vote. So it's not a throwback to landowners, saying, well, almost like bannermen, you have my vote and the vote of everybody who lives on my land or everybody in my town or my shire or whatever. This time you have a generation of politicians who realize that something has to be done and that the voices of ordinary working people and an emerging middle class have to be catered for and looked after.
Yes, as you said earlier, the idea of deference was very much in decline during the pre-First World War period. But I have to say that if you look at Parliament today, it's not really quite as grand as it was before 1914. And if you look at the history of Parliament in the 20th and 21st century, it does tend to refute Darwin's evolutionary theories. I mean, the people of that generation were really giants compared with what we've got today. I have to say that if you look at the debates in the House of Commons before 1914, they're so much more impressive than they are today.
So the majority of historians have, if you like, unfairly overlooked this period. What gave you the impetus, the spark, as it were, to go into here and to look around in this particular period of history and say, actually, it's not all the first motor cars and lovely manor parties. It is in fact an interesting, fascinating and vital part with a direct timeline to 21st century Britain.
Well, I suppose as with all books, simple curiosity. What was it like? But this is intended to be the first of a number of volumes on 20th century history. And as I said a bit earlier, I think this is a formative period of British history. You can't understand the rest of the 20th century without looking at that. And I did want to check whether it was really true. It sounds a bit implausible that Britain was actually on the verge of civil war in 1914. And I've come to the conclusion that it wasn't, that its problems, though difficult, would have been settled peacefully.
And do you think it's time for an appreciation and a re-evaluation of Lloyd George? Because many people, many sort of modern students, I doubt would even heard of Lloyd George. But he was. You mentioned Churchill. Lloyd George is pretty much up there, isn't he, in the figures of great British prime ministers?
Well, Lloyd George was a very complex figure. You might say that he's a rather superior Boris Johnson because he did break all the conventions, both the sexual conventions and the political conventions, but he did have great achievements to his credit. And I think it's only fair to say about Boris Johnson that although one can criticise him a lot, he does have some achievements to his credit, and they tend to be overlooked. Lloyd George's contributions are perhaps less overlooked, his role in building the welfare state and his role as a war leader in the First World War. But he did have many weaknesses. It's very difficult to write a really good biography of Lloyd George, I think. I'm not sure there is one. The same with Churchill. They're both such enormously complex characters.
And you mentioned how quickly, because your book finishes in 1914, this particular volume finishes in 1914, but it was quite incredible how quickly Europe found itself being pulled into a major conflict.
Yes, indeed. It was a tremendous blow to liberal aspirations. People at the beginning of the 20th century thought that war was something of the past. There had been no great war in Europe since the Napoleonic Wars, which ended in 1815. There had been some local wars, but nothing really involving all the major powers. And people also assumed any war would be a quick one, like the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71. No one was prepared for the horrors of war that they faced. And of course, no one was prepared for another war 30 years later, which really destroyed Europe for the 20th century and led to two totalitarian ideologies, Nazism and communism. Communism didn't, in fact, collapse till 1989 in Europe. So it was a terrible century, which no one really predicted. But nevertheless, Britain retained through that century its basically liberal ethos, perhaps fortunate being an island and separated from some of the horrors of the continent. And its political culture, I think, still bears much more in common with countries like, say, Australia, Canada and New Zealand than with the continent, with Europe. And it's fair to say the European Union, to some extent, was a reaction to the horrors of the Second World War, which Britain didn't really face to the same extent.
But one of the things that comes through from your book is perhaps that liberal DNA runs through the British parliamentary system and runs through the British people, and that is why post 1918 we have those strides in welfare systems and trade unions, etc., that other countries weren't willing to accept.
Absolutely. And of course, Britain remained during the interwar period, despite the Depression, free of fascism or communism. They had only minuscule support. The fascists were never strong enough to contest a parliamentary election. The communists won just 1 or 2 seats, despite a very severe depression. Britain's liberal culture remained and survived.
The book is called The Strange Survival of Liberal Britain, Politics and Power Before the First World War. It is by Vernon Bogdanor, who I've been speaking to today. Vernon, if people want to find out more about yourself or about the book, is there a website? Where can people find you?
There's no website, but anyone can email me on my King's College address, which is vernon.bogdanor@kcl.ac.uk.
The book will also be available as a virtual download from our own virtual bookstore. The book is called The Strange Survival of Liberal Britain. Vernon Bogdanor, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.